In my face-to-face coaching, a lot of my clients ask me, Michele, how long did it take for you to recover from narcissistic abuse after you detoxified your life of toxic people? And I always tell them that honestly, I didn't even realize that I needed to do things to help myself to recover. For example, I thought that after realizing about toxic individuals and emotional predators, after removing them from my life, I thought that I would be fine. I thought that without them, I could begin healing, that it would be a natural process. Yeah, I was in for a rude awakening. I had no idea what complex PTSD was. So what happened was, after I was out of all toxic relationships, I noticed that my feelings, my thoughts, behaviors, a lot of my core beliefs, the way I looked at myself, the way I looked at the world, a lot of the things that I had developed as a result of the abuse, I realized that they weren't going away. So complex PTSD does not go away like the common cold. The symptoms don't simply disappear with time. We tend to hear that time heals all wounds. It is true with a lot of wounds, but it's not true when it comes to emotional trauma and complex PTSD. So for anyone wondering if they have complex PTSD, if they need to do any inner work so that they can move forward after toxic relationships so that you don't stay stuck, because that's what happens. When you don't realize that there's something that you need to do for you, the years will go by and you can literally stay stuck in the same emotional states, the same behavior patterns, the same anxieties and or depressions. You can stay stuck in them as if the toxic person was still in your life. In this video, we're going to talk about 5 of the most common features of complex PTSD. We're going to talk about several different symptoms so that you can see what it looks like if you might have it. And then we're going to talk about some of the developmental arrests that happen as a result of complex PTSD. And I'm hoping that this information will provide you with what you need in order to understand what you may be feeling or going through, even though you are no longer in any toxic relationships. Okay. Also, just to let you know that at the end of this video, there is a resource available for anyone that wants further help or assistance when it comes to overcoming complex PTSD. So if you've ever wondered if you have complex PTSD, watch this video. So 5 of the most common features of complex PTSD are emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner or outer critic, and social anxiety. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to break down each one of those features and explain them, but my upcoming videos are going to be all about different pieces of these features and symptoms. So if there are any ones that you want to learn more about, make sure you let me know in the comment section below. So what would it feel like if you had complex PTSD? So I'm going to talk about what it would feel like first if you were still in the toxic relationship, and then I'm going to talk about what symptoms or what it would feel like if you were already out of the relationship. So if you were still in the relationship, you would feel very confused. You would have a hard time holding on to your reality. And that's a side effect of living a life full of gaslighting. So there's a strong sense of questioning your own reality, questioning your judgment, questioning if you're seeing things the right way, if you're reaching the right conclusions, to the point that a lot of people begin to feel like they're going crazy. They begin to question their own sanity. There's a book that I read that I actually use in my certification course for life coaches, but it's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And I love one line that it says in that book. It talks about how you feel like you're going crazy. And in a sense, it's true, because what happens as a result of emotional trauma, what happens as a result of narcissistic abuse, is you lose executive functioning of certain parts of your brain. So there's a neurological component with narcissistic abuse where it really affects your mental capacities, your brain capacities when it comes to logic, using the logical parts of your brain together with the emotional side of your brain. And that's a whole topic of its own, but I just wanted to add that. So there's a really strong sense that you feel like you're going crazy. A lot of people feel detached. It's almost like your body's there. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's talking to people. It's communicating. It's getting things done. But it's almost like you're watching yourself as if you're in a movie. And you're seeing yourself. And you feel very disconnected from your authentic self. You also justify the abuser. This is something that happens when you are still under the spell, I can say, or I should say, of narcissistic abuse, where people maybe on the outside, few people, because normally the narcissist makes sure that no one healthy can really get to you, but every now and then somebody is able to see through what's going on, and they might be telling you, you know, it's a little strange that this is happening, or doesn't it bother you when he or she does this or that, or treats you like that, this or that. And somebody that's with a narcissist that possibly is already experiencing complex PTSD. And of course, this is overlapping with so many other things like trauma bonding and codependency, and there's so many different things, but I am trying to focus just on CPTSD right now, even though there is an overlap with other things. But anyway, somebody might say, doesn't that bother you? And the victim of narcissistic abuse that's suffering under the spell will defend the abuser and minimize and paint it in a way trying to justify the behavior. It's one of the most frustrating things for people that are outside looking in and trying to help their family members. It doesn't seem to make sense. Again, that's another topic altogether that we could talk about, but that is something that happens. Now, if the person leaves the relationship and doesn't really have the clarity as to, you know, what's going on with the other person and what's going on inside of themselves, if they leave, here are some symptoms that they may be faced with. There's a deep, almost pathological sense of loneliness that the person that has left has. And it's often that loneliness, the pain of that loneliness that can potentially drive them back into the arms of a toxic person. Their self-esteem is very fragile. And for that reason, a lot of people that have left are very vulnerable at that point. And they can, if they're not careful, they can fall into another toxic relationship if they jump into a relationship fast, because their self-esteem has been so eroded that anyone that comes along and tosses a little bit of a compliment or a little bit of a crumb of attention can be very tempting for somebody that's still vulnerable and still healing at this stage. Some other symptoms are attachment disorders, whether it's that a person can develop an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style, something that is challenging after leaving the toxic relationship. Another symptom that's really difficult is the fact that whatever emotional states you lived in with the toxic person because you had to, and I know for anyone that doesn't understand narcissistic abuse, they would think, well, why would you have to, be in an emotional state? You can be whatever you want to feel. Well, that's true under normal situations, but if you've been with a narcissist, they will train you to be in certain emotional states. For example, let's say you're happy. You're a happy person, but every time you're happy, you're screamed at, you're yelled at, you're insulted, you're accused of doing something false, something very negative happens, which is exactly what happens with narcissistic abuse. Your happiness is a threat to the fact that they can't feel real happiness. So every time you're happy, something negative happens. Eventually, if this happens over and over and over again, daily, weekly, for years, what happens is that your brain begins to associate certain emotions with something negative, and as a coping skill, it doesn't allow you to go in the direction of those emotions anymore. So even after the relationship is over, You might still be struggling with depression, anxiety, an inability to feel real joy, real happiness, or any emotion that made the toxic person angry. Dissociation is another symptom where you still feel disconnected, or maybe you dissociate by just distracting yourself by doing, so that it's almost like you're trying to outrun the feelings that are painful inside that you don't want to feel. So those are some symptoms. Suicidal ideation, where sometimes you just think that not being alive would be less painful. And another symptom is having a hair-triggered fight or flight. In other words, you're reacting with such strong emotional responses that are out of proportion to the current things that are evoking those responses. So those are a group of symptoms that you can kind of evaluate, kind of look at yourself and see if they resonate with you. Now let's talk about some of the developmental arrests that are the result of complex PTSD. And what I mean by developmental arrests are the fact that as a result of the abuse, certain parts of your emotional growth are stunted. They're affected. I want to read directly out of an article that I'm going to put in the description box below, because this is exactly what happens with complex PTSD. As a result of these developmental arrests, the person's attempts to compensate for this disability become habitual, long-term defensive coping mechanisms. These become personal sticking points in life and are the source of negative personality traits. By keeping the individual out of alignment, they literally block him or her from the natural flow of positive emotions such as love, abundance, health, and joy that should be available to all. In other words, because of the developmental arrests, we get coping skills that keep us stuck. Okay, that's a simple version of what I just read. So what does that mean? How can I help you guys to see that? So, for example, on this list of developmental arrests that I'm going to share with you, one of them is the capacity for full self-expression. So, if you are not allowed to express yourself, if you're not allowed to have feelings, if you're not allowed to be upset when somebody hurts you, if you're not allowed to have justifiable anger, if you're not allowed to be happy because it's a threat to somebody else, what happens as a result of this being stunted, right? That the development of healthy expression is now stunted. The coping mechanism is you turn off your feelings. How then does this coping skill hinder your happiness and all the positive emotions? Well, think about it. If you can't feel your feelings, how can you feel happy or joy? If you can't feel your feelings, if you can't express your feelings, you're never going to be assertive. You're never going to protect yourself if somebody hurts you or crosses a boundary, right? Because your coping skills to shut down and just stifle it. It's not going to result in a quality that can enhance a relationship. So you can see how the developmental arrest causes coping skills that keep you stuck in certain feelings. Okay, so with that in mind, with that illustration, you can use it as I make the list of developmental arrests. You can use those to think about how you might have developed certain coping skills as a result of these that are keeping you from happiness. Self-acceptance, your sense of identity gets arrested and distorted. Self-compassion. You don't treat yourself with compassion. You actually internalize. If you think about how you talk about yourself, you internalize how the abusive person talked to you. And so you've lost your self-compassion. Self-protection. You lose the capacity to draw comfort from relationships or to feel safe in relationships. The ability to relax is gone. Most people that have CPTSD live in a constant state of fight or flight, or they're constantly in survival brain. They never feel like they can just be. They're on guard. They're hypervigilant. And your capacity for full expression is stunted. Your willpower, your motivation, your peace of mind, the belief that life is a gift, Your self-esteem and self-confidence are all distorted and eroded. And again, as a result of these developmental arrests, you've developed coping skills that are keeping you from the happiness that you want to experience. So, we talked about the 5 common features. We talked about what it would look like and feel like. And we talked about some of the developmental arrests. So go through this information. Obviously, the more symptoms that resonate with you, then the higher the chance that you may want to look into complex PTSD. This video is not to diagnose anybody, but it is to open your eyes to the fact that leaving emotional abuse is not crossing the finish line. It's literally just the first step towards your healing. So if you've been out of the relationship and you still feel stuck, in the same emotional states, if you feel like you can't move on, you haven't been able to kind of close that door and start living as who you really are, having the life that you really want, then there's a strong possibility that you might have complex PTSD. So it's definitely something you want to start learning about. Don't get stuck just learning about the toxic person. Make sure that you learn about what you need to do so that you can move forward. And for anyone that wants extra assistance on that, make sure you check out my 3-month workshop where together with 10 other individuals, we work together to work through the symptoms of complex PTSD. You can check it out on my website, and you can even read the testimonials of some of the individuals that are actually in my current 3-month workshop.